You're listening to the Prime Pod. My name is Robert McLean. Today's topic is both complex and controversial: the impact of ESG ratings on real estate valuations. I have three guests for this episode, all from Cushman Wakefield. Richard Hogg is head of Valuation and Advisory Services for Central Europe. Stefan de Goeij is head of Sustainability and ESG at CEE, while Michaela Killingerova is in Cushman's Real Estate Valuation Division. Let's take a step back first to take a look at ESG. Stefan and Michaela, you were at the recent EMEA RICS ESG conference. What were the hot topics there?
Yeah, my takeaway from being in Budapest at the Built Environment European Summit, organized for the third time by RICS, is that first of all, it's wonderful to see the people that are there, decision makers, government, and other bodies that are very familiar with what is going on in the decarbonization, specifically in the European Union, which at the moment is, when we come back later to the Czech Republic, a very interesting, let's say, momentum in time we are, with regulation kicking in next year, and also what is going on today within the market. My takeaways there were certainly that there are many professionals on a level knowing what needs to happen, but they're all struggling also with how do we really start to exercise this. So we probably will come back about data, the lack of data that is not supporting us. We spoke with institutes like INREF, who were there, which is from Amsterdam for the international investors. We spoke obviously also with RICS, which has a fourth edition of the, let's say, the valuation in commercial real estate sustainability coming out. And I think the cohesion and the messages we gave each other there were very helpful, but we know we're on a very difficult path, which not only is disturbed by, let's say, President Trump in the White House, also the war in Ukraine is pushing the agenda backwards, or at least towards the not where it's supposed to be. And I think those are my first takeaways, that certainly there is a full understanding what needs to happen, but the market is struggling at the moment. Okay, how do we get the consensus really into the assets and the portfolios?
Okay. Michaela, what did you find the most interesting at the conference in Budapest?
Sure. From the valuation perspective, for us, the most important are basically the examples from the market, which we see that there is that there is a shift in thinking of all the participants. So there are requirements in lease agreements. There are requirements from banks that all the valuers see. And not only that, but also we have to bear in mind the global outlook. So although we are basically behind, we still are progressing.
Richard, when I think about this, I can see a few different mindsets that might impact valuations when it comes to ESG. That ESG is a complication for valuations. Alternatively, that valuations may be a complication for proponents and people who are real advocates for ESG. At the end of the day, though, investors pay what they think the building is worth. Can we even isolate the impact of ESG on an evaluation?
I think it's almost the perfect question, in that it would be the response I would give to anyone asking me how valuers are supposed to tackle the issue. I always circle back to the same theme in terms of any aspect of real estate and how we as valuers should report on that. And the simple fact is we are required to report on what the market thinks itself. So the valuers do to some extent exercise judgment on the data that we collect from the marketplace, but in fact it's the market specifically that needs to decide for itself how it's going to continue to deal with all aspects of valuation, and ESG is just one component of that. So I think that's really the pivot for I think the discussion in general is how is the market going to deal with this? How is the market going to reflect ESG issues materially in terms of the fabric of real estate, in terms of how building owners invest, and we as valuers then have to assemble all of the different stakeholders' viewpoints and quantify it. And I think that word is the challenge that we as a profession face at the minute. It's quantification, and it's a challenge for us because it's a challenge for the market. And at this stage, the trajectory is clear in the fact that these issues are becoming increasingly relevant, but actually that quantification is still probably a few steps away, but certainly it's becoming it's now a mandatory component of our work to think about these issues and to report on them
as valuers.
As valuers, yes. So the RICS Red Book, which is our key document in terms of advising how we should behave in any exercise, it's now mandatory upon us as professionals and being members of that institution that we need to report on these factors. That is different than the quantification. The quantification is the next step. And we can explore how those quantification aspects are coming into the advice we give to our customers. But I think just to sort of summarize that, ultimately we have to do what the market tells us. We have to assemble information, but the quantification is ultimately our decision, but we have to derive that quantification from information that we get from the marketplace.
I mean, part of the problem is, unlike rents and unlike vaults, the amount of time left on the average lease in a building, ESG is to a certain extent a matter of personal beliefs and values.
I think the idea you raise about it being very much about people's opinions, I think that has been the case. Mm-hmm. But I think there are concrete changes to the regulatory environment in terms of how buildings need to be configured, both now and in future. I think there are real fundamental regulatory changes. So whilst I think historically, yes, our opinion or the opinion of people around the issue has been very much the key in terms of the discussion, I think there are fundamental changes going on, which will mean that building owners, for example, need to comply with specific regulations. And if they don't do that, there are real-world implications, not only market implications deriving from investors and sellers and tenants, not only from that side, but additionally, for example, banks themselves have increasingly stringent internal requirements in terms of how they lend and how green the buildings are into which they essentially invest. Banks are, arguably invest more money than anyone in real estate. So they're a very important piece of this story. So I think it has very much been about opinion, but I think that's changing.
Yes, and to get back to what you said, that it's of our beliefs. I mean, you can also take it from the other side and make it a new modern, a new standard, a new investments. It's not only about this part, but it's also about how to modernize your property to the next level. Mm-hmm. And this is where ESG or sustainability or this transformation, in whatever definition of that word we can put in this context, is.
Right. One of the issues I run into, and I'm sure you guys run into it all the time, it's your job too, is that when you talk to building owners, when you talk to asset owners, you mentioned the regulations that are coming up. There's still not clarity on that in terms of what I think they call the runway is, in terms of like how much more energy efficient, if we just stick to that one issue, how much more energy efficient do buildings have to be by the year 2030, by the year 2035, by the year 2040. Can you give us like the current state of play? Because one of the questions obviously is, if you're going to get fined a certain amount, if you don't live up to those regulations, does that cost more or less than the improvements you would have to make?
Yeah, to start with the latter, we know that on European and global level, we're roughly 5% behind. We saw also in Budapest the presentation from the UN.
Sorry, 5% behind what?
Behind the original Paris Agreement we had in 2000, 2009, I believe, something like that. So we're behind where we should be. Specifically looking at the status, I spoke last night with the Ministry of Finance and several banks. Currently, and people from the government were there as well. So currently, most of the directives are agreed, and we're talking about the Energy Performance Buildings Directive that will come into place 29th of May 2026. So we're talking about roughly, 5-6 months from now. The government itself has, let's say, the first priority to start a database on public buildings. This is what is running at the moment. It's run by the Ministry of Trade and the Ministry of Finance. They have millions of assets, obviously residential included, and they're doing quite okay, I understand. So this is all to be done in June next year. Why do I say this? The Czech Green Building Council is involved in that with Simona. They are participating in this project because we need to define the bottom 15% of the Czech Republic, so the 15% worst performing.
We're talking about commercial buildings, not residential buildings.
Both,
is that right?
Both, but we're talking about commercial in first instance.
Right.
They need to start, yes. Residential will come, I think, later on in the process. But the public sector needs to be there in 2028 already. So that's something that is coming up. I think from let's say the other perspective, now the banking, the Czech National Bank needs to follow the let's say the European Banking Authority regulation that is coming in the 26th of January. So a lot of regulation is coming up front. Now, where do we stand with the decarbonization? Was your question as well, to follow on those minimum energy performances that are being put by the EU? I think we're doing pretty well in Czech Republic because the building permit processes, I'm talking about the newer stock, right? So 5 years, maybe till 7-8 years, they're pretty fine, right? And everything that's being new built, it's a minimum, whether you're industrial, whether you're office, retail, it comes out pretty good. Not that much lately, obviously, but it's of a good quality, so we're not afraid about that. Is that standing portfolio? That's a pain.
Because that's 98% of all buildings. So really the issue is how to deal with the older ones, especially anything that's older than, say, 5-7 years. Pre-COVID buildings is really really the problem issue right now. Not knowing when you're going to have it 30% better, 30% improvement, and how much you're going to pay if you don't achieve that.
Yeah, so we're going to start with an EPC, with a minimum energy performance certificate that needs to run on a commercial building, running from, I don't know it from the head, but we're looking at an E minimum. That will go to a D, conforming the Green Deal, which needs to be set in 2030 in all EU member states. Czech Republic will most likely follow, let's say, the advice from the European Union on minimum standards, which are not that tough, honestly. Therefore, the Netherlands and other European countries already said, okay, we go to a minimum of C for offices, and that's already running from January 1st, 2023. So if you don't have a minimum energy label of C, D, E, F, you're not allowed to run it as an office in the Netherlands. So the standards will be there. So that will be set. Then it's up to the investors, to the funds, to the landlords themselves. Okay, how much do I want to distinguish myself from competition to keep my building attractive? And I think this is where the market will start, separating themselves. Okay, this is a B, C, D grade, and this is an A grade. And I think ultimately that somehow will come back into the valuation. I'll leave that to my colleagues. But there will be obsolescence. For example, the Prague office market will create obsolescence in office market where we see, okay, this is not attractive anymore. And that could be a building of 8-9 years old where the owner thinks, yeah, I need to invest maybe 4 or 5 million euros to come compliant with EU taxonomy, with smart metering, with BMS, everything that is technically described and already in place, it's going to cost me too much money.
Richard, when you hear sort of the framework of a regulatory plan, then does that give you enough to go off of in terms of filtering that into the view you take on a building? And I'm talking about older buildings, about existing stock.
Not by itself, but it's implied. Its impact is implied through how the market is going to respond to this. So, if I could just maybe rewind just one step, something Stefan said I think is important to dwell on, and then we can come back to the more secondary type of asset. But valuations at its essence an exercise in comparing things with each other. We gather comparable evidence, we gather information from the marketplace, and we apply that to whatever building it is that we happen to be valuing. So we have reference points. So the reference points that we have, generally speaking, connected the most concretely to is this idea of a prime building. And Cushman Wakefield and all of our competition publish monthly prime yield or quarterly prime yield numbers. And that will basically be released into the public domain, and it will give the wider marketplace an idea of where we, as the advisors in the market, think the two key variables of a value go, which is the rent and which is the yield. And that will relate to a prime building. What Stefan has obviously explained there is that all the new products that are being delivered to the market, the new developments, they're all reaching very good standard of EPC, PEMB ratings. So from my perspective, the definition of what a prime building has fundamentally changed over the course of the last few years. Whilst it's not explicitly stated as such yet, from my perspective, a prime building now is a green building. You have to have a good standard of EPC, PEMB. You potentially have to have some of the other third-party certifications, BREEAM or LEED, something like that. So the more and the better of these certifications or EPC ratings you have, and the better they are, the more prime your building is. When buildings don't come up to those prime standards, obviously there is an adjustment made from that prime rate. But the point I want to make is that adjustment is now implied. It is now implied that very, very good green certification EPCs, they are integrated into that prime building. So it is already concretely affecting our valuations through that dynamic. And I think that feeds back to a question you asked earlier about what's implied. How can we separate this out? It's clear that at the top end of the market, we can see the upside that having a very good EPC rating. The challenge, of course, and it's the $1 million question, is how do we adjust for more secondary assets, a building that has a lower EPC. At the minute, the market's not entirely clear, but regardless, what is helping us a little bit in terms of this topic is that older buildings, generally speaking, are not as valuable as newer buildings just by virtue of their age. So it's already in the age adjustment that we would make on any property. But you're going to come to the question is how much of that, and is that accelerated by ESG factors?
Essentially, what we're talking about is the CapEx costs that is going to have to be put into the building to make it energy efficient. Is in a sense is how we isolate what the value of the ESG is. Is that a useful way to look at it, do you think?
First of all, this level of regulation here is already affecting the requirements of participants such as banks that are very important for us as valuers because they are one of our most important clients. And their requests are in some countries already very specific, such as, yes, give us the valuation of a property as is, but also provide a valuation of a property being A grade.
Wow. Okay.
And for this, obviously, there is no comparable evidence yet, because this is very new for this location. And for that, currently, some countries are using third-party tools, but these are not yet very accurate. So this is only for being at the same page within the country for all valuers, the same third-party tool. But this needs improvements, and this is where CapExes are somehow calculated based on some evidence from either government or other markets and so on. So there's where you can get some CapEx or some other costs, but this is not only about CapEx, this is also about OpEx. Because not only costs that you are improving your property with are important, but also the costs which you have to pay for the property not being compliant, not being environmentally safe, let's say. So there is also a risk of higher costs, operating costs on insurance, for instance, and then you have to actually do some measures, protective measures, to reach some level.
Richard, you mentioned that banks are one of your biggest clients in general. Are the banks, in a sense, a really good measuring stick? They seem to have a fairly clear view on what their mandate is, and I think they look at regulations probably the most clearly.
I think they are a good yardstick. I'd say a few things. First of all, the questions we're being asked, or the number of questions that we're being asked, are increasing. Those questions are getting more specific. They're getting more technical. Some of our banking customers are already commissioning additional technical reviews of buildings into which they'll be lending money. So it's not just a valuation they commission, they're also commissioning a technical review. So that would be something that could be undertaken, for example, at Cushman Wakefield by our PDS team, our project management team. They'll go into the building, they'll investigate the quality of the plant and machinery, the age of the plant and machinery, the functionality, exactly how it performs in terms of environmental criteria. And that is introducing a new component in terms of how we look at the buildings, because ultimately those kind of technical studies, what you derive from that is a potential cost, which is the point that you've made, and that cost is going to have a bearing on a real estate valuation. There's one more thing to say about that. Does the cost improve the value of the building, or does the cost take away from the value of the building? So again, the issue remains cloudy at the minute, but it's a great example of the issue in general. The point you make is, are banks, a good sector of the market to look at when we sort of try and project how the market will deal with this issue? Yes, they definitely are, and clearly they are looking at this issue very in a lot of detail, and increasingly so.
Stefan, you said a point we would probably come back to was data, and I think we should, just because there's been this whole revolution in terms of the data that is possible to collect as a building owner. There is the possibility of creating digital twins. I think that's been going perhaps a bit slower than a lot of people would want. But how quickly, to what extent are these coming EPC tightening of the screws in terms of the regulations on that and ESG requirements, is that driving the use of really careful, minute, granular data? Because that then carries into what the valuers can stick into their models.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. So the lack of data is momentarily something that also for the valuers is worrying. Honestly, we heard examples from other countries as well. So there's two perspectives. So you have an EPC, an energy performance certificate, which has a grading, whether it's A, B, C, D, doesn't matter that much. But that is at the moment still 10-year valid. So you can talk about an EPC for building X, but it's C grade and it's 8 years old. What does that say about the current daily consumption? Nothing. So if you compare that, and this is also where regulation starts to kick in next year, is that we are looking at energy use intensity. So we're looking what you actually are consuming. And I think also from a data perspective, this is where landlords and owners might also be a little bit afraid, like, yeah, I have this great, EPC, but I know that my daily consumption is actually much higher than it is set on the EPC. The lack of data is just basically, we have a lot of opportunities to get the data with new building management systems, and new smart metering. It's perfect. We need to start reporting on that, and the national database is being built up for that. That will all improve in the next coming years till 2030. But yeah, there's a long way to go, and we speak Cushman Wakefield globally. We support our clients with gathering data, monitoring the data, and improving on the data, and that's a long haul, honestly, because it's still, and it's surprising maybe, but a lot of buildings we still have facility managers walking around looking at a manual meter, what is the water consumption from last month, putting it in an Excel table, and that's being uploaded somewhere. And if as a valuer you need to depend on that kind of information, I would feel uncomfortable. So yeah, there's still a long way to go.
I've heard foreign investors who are frustrated by their lack of ability to buy things in this market say that they suspect that Czech funds that are buying buildings at this moment are underestimating the amount of investment that is going to need to be made for them to have institutional grade real estate, and they're overpaying because they don't realize how much CapEx they're going to be put in. I've heard Czech investors say that they think their Western counterparts are overthinking the issue. Stefan, maybe do you see a different approach from the owners of buildings at this point? Do you see a difference in, I don't know if we want to call it Central Europe, Western Europe, international, family office?
Yeah, I do. Confirming that, yeah. So involved with my colleagues in the Netherlands, in Germany, specifically in Germany, it's going through a whole rattle of parameters in terms of sustainability before it's even considered. Stay versus go scenarios also from tenants and occupiers look differently in other countries. So we see that is, I would not say it's just different, not better, not worse. I'm not saying that, but it's just approached differently. Mm-hmm. So certainly in capital markets, in acquisitions by and sales side, we are involved in calculating decarbonization pathways, how much CapEx does need to be invested to reach a certain level, whether that is an energy performance level or something different that maybe corporate strategy put up with a headquarters somewhere in APAC or in the Americas. So yeah, there's a difference. If we see it here local, still ESG DDs are being done. We're looking at compliance of EU taxonomy. We're trying to understand what it will take to get to a B certificate, energy performance certificate, as Richard already said. But it seems to be a bit more pragmatic here. And that might be because it became very local. So I'm very aware of what you just said, that I don't think necessarily that the Czech funds investors are underestimating it. They are just approaching it differently. And I think they talk to each other. It's not a very big market. They know the assets in and out. So you talk to the I talk to the investors, they really know what they need to do. Mm-hmm. They're just profoundly careful with it.
Do you think at some point we will reach a state in which we're not even talking about ESG because it's become part of the natural way that building owners, developers, and valuers approach the issues that we now have to name?
I may hope so, yes. and I will take you for a beer or two when that happens.
I think we already see it normalizing. I think if you think 2 or 3 expos ago, I can't remember which one, but it was suddenly the only thing we talked about. And then, more recently, in particular this year, I noted that it was no longer the key topic, and that wasn't because the topic had gone away. It was because it was a mature. I think that's a symptom of a maturing issue, rather than one that's becoming less important. So I think that is already the trend. It is. I fall back on what I said about being a prime building. It is to be the best prime building in the market. You have to be one of the greenest buildings in the market. I think that's just now a fact, and everyone's clear on that.
We have one priding issue in Prague specifically, and that's the cultural heritage, right? Because that's the part where we can't do much. It's just protect it and come to energy efficiency. Those are, they will be exempted. But what will that do to investors if it has an EPC D, E, F, and we can't invest in it to upgrade that? What will that do with that stock? I don't know, but it's going to be very interesting how that works out.
I think that's the next chapter. I think this chapter is closed. I'd like to thank the 3 of you for coming in today and for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.